Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my final verdict on the Sony a7R Mark IV. And of course, this is the fourth generation of the a7R series, and it is the first of any of Sony's series to reach a Mark IV status. And of course, the R series of cameras has become what is Sony's higher resolution models, and none higher than this one at an incredible record-setting 61 megapixels. And so the previous high resolution king that I had used was the Canon 5DS and 5DSR at around 50 megapixels. And so this ups the ante even a bit higher. And so we have got a significant 32% increase over the a7R Mark III. And so definitely a significant amount of resolution there. Now, if you have not been following along in this review series, I'm going to just kind of skim highlights here, and if you want to see everything, you can check out the playlist. But in our first look episode, we gave an overview comparison between the R4 and the R3. And as a part of that, we explored some of the significant ergonomic changes that have been made here, which include a much improved grip where the camera feels much better in the hand, much easier to use without a grip extender. And I noted when doing research for my text review that whereas the R3 was released with an optional grip extender right at the time of launch, I noticed that there's no corresponding grip extender for the R4. And I think a big part of that is that Sony has greater confidence that it's going to fit people's hands better. Now, of course, there is, a new battery grip that has been released. And so that's always an option. And that while it won't, older battery grips, because of the change in the shape, won't fit here, this does share a physical body with the A9 Mark II, and so it will be shared across that platform. But beyond the grip, we also found improved buttons in terms of their feel, their throw, an improved joystick in the back, improved placement of the various dials, and so everything is falls to hand just a little bit easier. The button placement, while basically all of the buttons and wheels are the same as what we've seen before, their placement has been optimized, their feel has been optimized, and it's little things like the significant raising of the AF on button, which also serves frequently as the magnify focus button. So if you're using manual focus lenses, the fact that your thumb very naturally finds that makes that little simple maneuver so much easier and more intuitive and tactile, which makes using the camera better overall. There has also been a significant improvement to the viewfinder that has now grown from 3.6 million dot resolution to 5.7 million dot resolution, making for a more engaging and lifelike viewing experience. Another change that has been made here is that the memory card door has been redesigned where it feels upscaled. The two memory card slots are now both UHS 2 compatible, and in just another logical, backfilling move, they have actually put the #1 card slot at the top rather than at the bottom, which is, of course, the more logical placement. One thing you'll find as you look inside all of these various compartments is that you can see improved weather sealing gaskets that are there. So there's definitely an improvement there. There's also a more logical design of these doors to where previously, if you opened up doors to the ports, things would just kind of hang down in your way on the R3. That's not the case on the R4. In this case, you can see it just kind of dangles and would get in the way if you're doing multiple things there on the side. That's not the case with the design of the R4, where it opens up more like a real port, and it's just a more logical thing. And so some of the other kind of features that we've seen added via firmware, of course, native here, including an intervalometer. And so that's great for being able to do time lapses. The one thing that I wish was an option is the ability to make that movie like what you're seeing right now in camera, rather than having to get all of those shots off the camera and then do the movie in post. And so certainly like on Canon cameras, for example, you have the ability to do the time-lapse movie in camera. And I would like to see that yet added. But really, when it comes to the ergonomics of the camera, I only have one serious complaint. And that complaint is that the touchscreen is still underutilized here, and that they've hardly expanded at all the ability over the years that I've been using Sony cameras, hardly expanded the ability of what you can do via touch. And so no menu navigation, no touch to shutter activate. Just there's missing pieces there, and it seems like an easy thing for Sony to fix, which it has not yet. One final observation that I'll make is that so far, all of the Sony full-frame cameras that I've used have been very, very prone to getting sensor dust. And of course, someone like myself notices that a lot because I work with so many lenses, I review a lot of lenses, I change lenses often, and so I am continually using a little blower and trying to clean off the sensor because there's always dust that is accumulating there. And so I would love to see Sony address that through some way, be it better coatings or maybe putting a, like Canon did with the EOS R, putting a little door that covers up whenever the camera is turned off and open. It would certainly be nice for them to do that. Now, in a second episode, which I called Sensor Wars, we took a look at the overall sensor performance and see kind of what are some of the advantages and the disadvantages that came with this resolution bump. And so specifically in that, I compared the A7R Mark III with the R4. And so as noted already, we went from 42 megapixels to 61 megapixels, which is about a 32% resolution increase. So what I noted as my takeaway from that is that while the A7R Mark IV is not as good as the A7R Mark III when it comes to, for example, higher ISO performance. And so you start to see more visible noise sooner, it is rougher, more obvious. There's also at higher ISOs just a little bit more of a color cast, specifically kind of a green cast that begins to come into the image. And so there is a little ground loss there. However, if you're familiar at all with Canon's 5DS or 5DSR, you'll note that Sony's actually done a great job of mitigating this potential downfall of such high resolution. The 5DS and 5DSR had an ISO limit of 6400, and noise was very, very intrusive even by that point. And so that's certainly not the case with the A7R Mark IV. At 6400, you can start to see noise, but it's not yet destructive. It's really not until the higher limits past ISO 12800, about 25,600 range, and it goes up to a native ISO of 32,000, and you certainly start to see the noise at that. And so anyway, that is kind of the negative trade-off of this resolution increase, is that in higher ISO situations, and not even just higher ISO settings, you will start to see some visible noise at lower ISO values than maybe what you're accustomed to if you've been shooting with the A7R Mark III, for example, and certainly if you're upgrading from a lower resolution camera like the A7 III. Dynamic range is rated about the same, and in my test, there's a little bit of give and take at different spots, depending on where you're looking, but I found dynamic range to be about the same. It's rated at about 15 stops, but that is actually a downsampled to, I believe, only like an 8 megapixel resolution. And so at native resolution levels, you're closer to being right under 14 stops dynamic range. That's also true about 14 stops if you are shooting video and you are shooting, in the Sony log, the S-Log profile, you have about 14 stops of dynamic range there as well. Now, the greatest advantage in many ways, kind of practical advantage that comes with such high resolution, is a very, very well executed APS-C mode on this. And so you go into a crop mode and you still have a hair over 26 megapixels of resolution, which actually out-resolves the current APS-C options on Sony. And so it gives you very high resolution. And in a later episode, I did compare it to the A6500 and found that the R4's image did very slightly favorably compare under that circumstance, at least at base ISO values in terms of the overall resolution. And so very, very positive there. Now, in a third episode, we actually looked at the resolution specifically and the realities of 61 megapixels. And certainly there are some considerations there. The resolution can be very, very useful, particularly because it allows you to deeply crop images and still have a lot of usable resolution. For example, in this shot here, I was stuck with a 35mm lens. I couldn't get closer to where I wanted to shoot, but I wasn't crazy about the composition. I was actually able to switch to a 16:9 crop ratio from the center of the image. And of course, this is a portrait-oriented, a vertical image, and I just took out some of the middle, and I was astounded to find that I still had essentially the native resolution of the A9, which I'm filming on right now, or the A7 III. And so still lots of resolution. And so it's certainly very useful for that. If you're a macro shooter, for example, or shooting wildlife and want a little extra reach, the ability to deeply crop while retaining high resolution certainly is a valuable addition there. Actually, the biggest problem with the resolution is not the resolution in and of itself. It's the fact that Sony has not given us any options for shooting at lower resolutions if you're shooting RAW. Now, if you're shooting JPEGs, you actually have an option of shooting the high full resolution to shoot at 26 megapixels and then even down at a 15 megapixel resolution. That's just not the case when it comes to shooting RAWs. And the only way to get a lower resolution count is to shoot in that crop mode, which does drop it to a 26 megapixel resolution. However, you're also introducing a 1.5 times crop factor and thus changing the angle of view of all the lenses that you attach. And so that's not always a desirable thing. To have a simple MRAW or SRAW option like most cameras have had over time seems to be never more important than in this moment on this particular camera. And I found, for example, with the 5DSR, that was not only a way to not have to shoot at that high resolution all the time. I actually found that the noise levels dropped when shooting at those lower RAW factors when I did that review. And so anyway, I really think that was a misstep by Sony, something that they should have done. Now, the other thing that we examined in that episode is kind of to address the misnomer out there that only certain lenses will work on a high-resolution camera like the A7R Mark IV, and how that, probably mostly due to marketing of certain lenses being able to resolve 50 plus megapixels, that some people have had the assumption that their lenses are just going to look awful when they mount them on there if they're not the very best G-Master type lenses. That's simply not the case. Here's the reality. The optical properties of any lens, now this happens to be a very good one. I'm a fan of this Sony Zeiss planar 50mm f1.4, but the reality is that the optical properties of this lens, they are there, and it's not going to change what camera that I attach it to. You can't change the optical formula of a lens just by mounting it on a different camera. However, what will happen on a higher resolution body like the A7R Mark IV is that if there are apparent aberrations, and we noted that that could be anything like coma and shooting the night sky, it could be, purple fringing, for example. It could be the kind of a bit of a softness of haze that comes from surface blur that takes place, and it can even be the reality of motion blur. But what happens is all of those optical flaws, instead of occupying fewer pixels and being less noticeable even at a 1-to-1 pixel level, they're going to occupy more pixels, and thus they're going to be more magnified at a pixel level. Looking at it globally, it's not going to look any better or any worse. In fact, in many cases, apparent resolution of any lens will be higher when you put it on a higher resolution body. There's simply more pixels there to work with. And so if you're downsampling, for example, often your comparative resolution will actually look higher after downsampling. And so it's important to understand the reality of that. A good lens that is well corrected and has few obvious optical flaws is not going to look worse when mounted on the A7R Mark IV. However, one thing that is really important because of, I mentioned motion blur, the fact that this camera, like most of Sony's more recent full frame bodies, does have the steady shot inside in-body image stabilization is really, really important. I noted when doing the 5DSR review that shooting with stabilized lenses was going to be all the more important with a camera like the 5DSR, and of course the A7R Mark IV, just for that reason that I've just noted, that it makes motion blur far more obvious. Now, of course, in this case, there's a huge advantage in that you've got a very, very effective, it's rated at 5.5 stops, but a very effective image stabilizer built in. Now, mostly due to Canon, for example, Canon has really touted that that lens-specific IS image stabilization works better than what a camera-oriented, a sensor-oriented image stabilization. If you're in a lab test comparing side by side, maybe there's truth to that. In real-world shooting, I have found, I have a great expectation of after reviewing, at this stage, hundreds of lenses, I have a pretty good expectation of how IS should perform. And I have to say that I get what I feel to be fairly comparable results, whether I'm shooting, in-body image stabilization or, lens-specific image stabilization. And so having that all the time with all lenses, I consider that to be the better approach, particularly with a high-resolution camera like that. And so it's kind of a big deal. Now, one thing to note with this higher resolution is that you do lose a little bit of buffer depth compared to the A7R3, and certainly compared to, like the A9. And so your buffer is just slightly smaller. Now, the good news is if you're shooting in APS-C mode, which by the way was true on the A7R Mark III as well, the buffer depth basically triples. And so you have a lot more room either with shooting RAWs or JPEGs when shooting there. It's worth noting that Sony has managed to retain the 10 frame per second burst rate of the A7R Mark III, despite that significantly higher resolution. However, do note that the other kind of flip side of high resolution is you're going to need more storage, obviously, due to the larger size of each individual file. You're also probably going to need more processing power if you have an underpowered workstation, because particularly if you're working with a high volume of lenses, it's bigger files require more processing power. And certainly that's a consideration if you're considering moving up. Now, in another episode, we took a look at the autofocus, and the autofocus has continued to improve in this camera. It's really fantastic now. We're up to 567 phase detect AF points that have about 86.5% total coverage of the sensor. And I found that in real world shooting that this camera handles very much like the A9. It still doesn't have as many PDAF points as what the A9 does. At the same time, though, it has enough to where tracking is very similar. It handles much better with adapted lenses and native lenses alike. And so continued progress on that front. And it was only when I was doing highly competitive tracking with adapted lenses, a lot of caveats there, that I noticed a difference that the A9 is still better when it comes to doing that kind of tracking. And again, I kind of wonder if the A9 does not have the potential to put out maybe just a little bit more voltage for driving telephoto lenses. But for most applications, you're going to be delighted with the focus system in the A7R Mark IV. And I found also it focused well in very low light conditions. And so I was very, very pleased with that. Now, one thing that we haven't talked a lot about is when it comes to video. And so I'm going to just kind of voice over and show you some footage here along the way. The main specs are largely unchanged from the A7R Mark III. Some people have written off any kind of improvement based on that because we still have the same codecs, we still have the same limitations when it comes to your options. In 4K, for example, it's still capped off at 30p. There is no 60p available, and so, and bit rate isn't quite as high as what, the optimal is. However, there are some improvements where downsampling in Super 35 is now done from a 6K readout and downsampled to 4K as opposed to 5K downsampled to 4K on the A7R Mark III. And so it's just a little bit cleaner process, less pixel binning that needs to happen there. And so, the footage is improved. What I mostly noticed is that there is less difference between the full sensor and the Super 35 footage. Previously, Super 35 was obviously cleaner looking than using the full sensor on the A7R Mark III. I don't really find that to be the case anymore with the A7R Mark IV. The other thing that is big here includes those improvements to the autofocus, in that now, rather than just having, face tracking, now you have real-time IAF even in video capture, not just when shooting stills. That obviously makes a difference, particularly for something like I'm doing right now, where I need to trust the autofocus to track my face correctly. I used to find that Canon's DPAF was kind of head and shoulders above Sony's autofocus tracking in these kinds of situations. I no longer feel that's the case. I feel like Sony has done a fantastic job, particularly through its IAF and face tracking technology, to get a much better end result, and so kudos to them. Another improvement is actually to the hot shoe, which is now called the multi-interface input. And so now you have the option with this new microphone that you can mount it on there and actually get digital recording through this interface. And so, another advantage there, that you can get true digital audio recording. The conclusion of the matter is, there is a little bit of irony that Sony is facing in its camera releases of late 2019. The A9 Mark II was announced with the same resolution as the A9 Mark I, 24 megapixels, and Sony got a lot of blowback over that. There was rumors floating of a 36 megapixel sensor that many people thought the A9 Mark II would have, and so it would have similar, frame rate specs and burst rate, I should say, while having higher resolution. That turned out to not be the case, and so Sony took some flack over staying with the same resolution on the A9 Mark II. Then, of course, Sony made a major upgrade to the resolution of the A7R Mark IV over the A7R Mark III, and the response has largely been more criticism. And a lot of people in the feedback to myself, and I certainly understand where people are coming from, I don't feel dissimilarly necessarily, and that is that they weren't necessarily looking for more resolution than 42 megapixels. There was a lot of the other advantages that they are hyped about to the camera, and they would rather have seen some other improvements come to the actual overall performance of the camera rather than focusing on more resolution. And I think that while there is some truth to that, and maybe there is some room for Sony to release a model with a 42 megapixel sensor with a lot of the other, handling upgrades, autofocus upgrades that the A7R Mark IV has, maybe, spec'd a little bit lower and priced a little bit lower than that camera. But I think that Sony could really have alleviated, and maybe still can via firmware. I don't know what the options are there, but it would be wonderful for them to release that in some way, to have the option of MRAW or SRAW, and so that you don't have to shoot 61 megapixels all the time. Even the 26 and 15 megapixel levels that they already have for JPEGs would be nice to have. I think that 45 and 30 megapixels would be even better options, and so that you can manage that resolution in a better way. At the end of the day, however, this is an excellent camera, and it shows a lot of added maturity. It's not like it's not doing a lot of things that Sony cameras have never done before. It's just that it's doing them better. And I believe that Sony is showing some maturation as a company, listening to some of the feedback from consumers and reviewers alike, and making the kind of real improvements to make their cameras better to use. Furthermore, since the A7R Mark III was released, Sony has gotten infinitely more third-party support. And over the last couple of years, there's been a ton of lenses released from companies like Tamron and Sigma and Samyang, all of these amongst others that have allowed the catalog to become much more robust. The only place I really see a lot of room that's left for improvement is more telephoto lenses to come, and it looks like at the very least, Tamron's coming out with a 70 to 180 millimeter f2.8 lens that will help to fill some of that niche. All the things are good here. It's just that 61 megapixels is maybe more resolution than what most people need in most situations. And maybe Sony overshot the market a little bit in that. If you need 61 megapixels, the A7R Mark IV is the best way to get there. And even if you don't, it's still a fantastic camera. You're going to have to make a decision at the end of the day how important that resolution and all the other upgrades are to you. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I have a full text review with a lot of documentation, lots of photos, so check that out. There's also an image gallery with photos from all kinds of different lenses that I've taken over my review period, so you can check that out. There's buying links in the description, along with linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.